in chapter 27. How many chapters are there? Test question. 28. We're almost to the end. So we left off in verse 25. And I think the last picture I showed you up here was the anchors. Again, just some things I pulled off the internet to kind of give us an idea of what, I'm trying to force to see a picture, because I don't know about you, but I remember things better when I see a picture. So let's pick up in verse 25, and we will continue. We'll get into chapter 28 tonight. We'll see how far we get. So remember, they've been in this storm, and this is a big storm. This is a really big storm. It's a 14-day long storm. When I was on active duty, the first time my ship went to sea, I was in a big storm. I was on a ship 600 feet long, and it was getting tossed around in the ocean like a pop can. I was sick, throwing up for 4 days, and I still had to go to work 3 times a day. I was working in the chow hall doing my mess duty, but the ocean is a mighty thing. And as I read this story and I see what seems to be maybe the fear in the sailors' hearts, I can kind of relate to that, because the sea, the ocean, is a mighty thing, and men have been in fear and in awe of it for a very long time. So they're in the storm. We're going to pick up in 25. Therefore, so I'm going to back up to 24. Paul says, do not be afraid. Or no, the Spirit is speaking to Paul. It says, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. So here's a promise of God to Paul. Do you think Paul has any doubts at this time? No. Even though the storm is big, he doesn't doubt, because he knows his God. And if God says it's going to happen, it's going to happen. So I'm sure that Paul has all the confidence in the world. Therefore, keep up your courage, men. So now Paul's encouraging these sailors. Keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. Wouldn't it be great if we could have that kind of confidence in all the storms that we face? I know it's going to turn out the way you said it's going to turn out, God. But sometimes we struggle with that, don't we? And so this could be a place where we could just remind ourselves, hey, Paul was in a big storm. And when I'm in a big storm, I can still have confidence in the promises of God. Yeah.
And I think, Paul was of such faith that he recognized God had power over the seas, and in Psalms it tells us to rule the surging sea when its waves mount up, you still them. We saw Jesus calm the waters of the seas, and so the sea is even brought up by God's power, and Paul knows he has power with that.
Yeah, imagine if this was Peter or one of those disciples that had been in the boat when Jesus spoke and the sea instantly became calm. Paul wasn't there for that experience, and yet it's the same God. And so Paul really, I think, has great confidence in what's happening. So verse 26 says, and you have your notes, right? So 22 through 26 notes that we got from our brother Ron are all together. And so what it says there is Paul encouraged everyone and made it known that God had communicated to him through an angel, and that everyone was going to be spared, but the ship would be lost. Whenever I hear that phrase, I can't help but think of the minnow. The minnow would be lost, Gilligan's Island, yeah. But he tells them in verse 26, we must run aground on a certain island. He's predicting what's going to happen. Verse 27, but when the 14th night came, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, at about midnight the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. They took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms, and a little further on they took another sounding, they found it to be 15 fathoms. So, you know, professional sailors, they have a sense of the sea that we can't even imagine. When a land mass is sticking up in the ocean, things change. There's lots of different subtle changes that would occur. And even though it's dark and they can't see the island, they sense something. So it could be a change in smell, could be a change in the, you know, how the wind is reacting, or even how the water is moving. But they sense something, and they take soundings. Does anybody know what it means to take a sounding? Measure how deep the water is. And so what they would do is they would let down a line with a weight on it. And a fathom is essentially the distance from your fingertip to your fingertip, and it's generally considered to be 6 feet. And so they keep letting down, and they're paying it out, and they're measuring it, and then pretty soon they feel it hit the bottom. You can tell like if you're fishing, you can tell when your big heavy sinker hits the bottom, right? Well, that's kind of what's going on. And so the first sounding that they take is 20 fathoms, which is how many feet? 120 feet deep. Now, in the big part of the ocean, if you tried to let your line down to take a reading, what would you normally get? Nothing, right? Because they don't have a 2 mile long rope. They only let that down when they anticipate that they're coming up on shallower water. So then they take a second reading, and we don't know how far apart they were. They wouldn't just pull it back up and let it right back down. There would be an interval of time. But the second time they check it, they see the bottom is rising up. And so again, professional sailors are going to know, oh, we are coming up on something. Doesn't necessarily have to be an island, but the bottom contour is coming up. So the depth of the water is changing. And then in verse 29, Luke's writing for us, fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. So here's the picture. It's midnight, it's dark, they can't really see. As far as we know from what's happening, the storm maybe is still going. Maybe it's not as, in my mind, I picture it being a little bit less than it was. But still, it's dark, they can't see, they've tested the water, they know they're coming up on something, and they're just waiting. When you read that, we wished for daybreak. What would we say today? Oh, we were just praying for daybreak, right? So they're waiting, they're hoping for the sun to come up so they can get their eyes and see what's going on, and then, make a good decision. Verse 30 says, but as the sailors were trying to, let me back up. So they put out 4 anchors from the stern. So as you're approaching land, you would drop your stern anchors in order to keep yourself from moving too close to the land, because you don't want it to happen in the night when you can't see. They're trying to slow the ship down. So they throw these 4 anchors out, and then again, here's some pictures of some ancient type anchors, and the idea would be that these would hit the bottom and start digging in, and then you would hope that the ship would just completely be stopped. But often that was not the case. The anchor would move, the ship would still be moving with some of these primitive anchors, depending on sea conditions and those things. But as the sailors were trying to escape, so here verse 30, but as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat into the sea on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow. So what we see here is, what was in, let's see, did we already learn what Paul's vision said, that everybody had to remain on the ship or they were all going to perish, or are we going to find that in a minute? Okay. Well, Paul knows, and he sees what he believes are some people that are trying to escape. Some of the sailors have decided, I'll take my chances here rather than continue to be in this 14-day storm. And so they've let down the small boat. Remember, we had a picture of that. They took it up when they were most likely towing it behind. They brought it onto the deck when the weather got really bad. Now they're putting it out. It says they were doing it on the pretense of, hey, Captain, we'll go let some anchors down in the bow and help get us secure. But that appears to not have been their genuine motive. Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved. That was right there. Unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved. Why would they give any weight to what Paul has to say about this?
Well, so far he's the only one that's been able to rescue them.
Yeah, so far he's kind of been spot on, right? Didn't he tell them, hey, I think we should lay up here. It's not a good idea. I perceive that there's going to be a great loss of the cargo in the ship, right? And now they've been in this 14-day storm. So what we see here is now where Paul's words being given more weight by the centurion.
Well, and with the confidence that Paul is having because of the guidance that he's received, in a chaotic time, people tend to migrate towards people that are calm, cool, and collected.
Yeah.
And so they're going to be, hey, look at this guy, he's got something going on.
Mm-hmm.
Let's ask him. So they're going to go to him, and with the sailors wanting to leave the ship, who's going to man the ship? So
Mm-hmm.
Paul knows that without them, he can't get to Rome, and it's not
Sure.
going to happen. So.
Yeah. Good leaders tend to calm chaos, right? So that's a great point. Then in verse 32, then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away. So here are some of these sailors. And remember, we showed about how big that boat was. It wasn't big, and it wasn't a lifeboat. It was just a work boat. A number of the crew were going to, try to get away. But while they're lowering the boat, the soldiers come over. Yeah.
It's interesting to me, like Paul says, if these guys get away, you can't be saved.
Mm-hmm.
But it may not be a prediction. It may just be without sailors on the ship. How are we going to navigate this situation? But it's interesting that even though God said, "I'll spare you guys, but I'm not going to spare the ship," Paul still felt necessary to take practical measures.
Sure, that could be a good point. Now remember, this is all going to happen now in fairly quick succession. From here to the end of the chapter, basically, the sun's going to come up, and things are going to happen. So, yeah, without the crew, the ship would have less chance of getting, of doing anything well. So that is also a good point.
But also, God tells us things,
Mm-hmm.
but sometimes we don't want to just do practical measures to ensure, feel like our effort would be successful, right? So I feel like there's kind of maybe a lesson here.
Yeah.
That just because God said you're going to be okay doesn't mean you don't have to take some steps to be okay.
Sure.
So.
Well, exactly. God gives us lots of assurances, right? But He never says, "Oh, just sit on your hands and everything's going to work out."
And that would be using wisdom and discernment.
Yeah. Yeah, and those are practical things that every human being has to be putting in place in order to move forward in life, right? So the soldiers cut away the rope and they let it fall away. So now it's adrift, it's a goner. Maybe it's going to drift in and get bashed up on the rocks too. We don't know, we don't care. Verse 33, until the day was about to dawn. So remember, this started at midnight. Maybe 5-6 hours later, the day's starting to dawn. Paul's encouraged them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. Now, as I read some commentaries on this verse, and what Ron says here is Paul encouraged everyone to eat and assured them they were all going to survive with no harm. He then offered a prayer and thanked God for their food. There is a time for private prayer and a time for public prayer, and he's got some verses there. many of the commentaries suggest that the way that this is translated, where they having taken nothing, would not be accurate. They would have not taken a meal. They wouldn't have sat down and taken whatever meal type schedule they had. You know, everybody didn't sit down and eat together. They ate in groups, like a watch group. But to think that they have not had a morsel of food for 14 days, I don't think is what it's actually trying to convey here. I think it's more likely that they've not had, it's been so busy and so hectic with this storm that they haven't had an opportunity to sit down and have a meal. Any comments on that? Anybody ever read anything like that before, or did you just read that at face value and say, okay, well, 14 days without food, I'd be hungry? That wouldn't take much to encourage me to eat if I had been gone 14 days without food. In my little story that I told you when I was sick for 4 days, I literally, I was mess cooking, so I would get up in the morning and I would go to the mess decks where the food was prepared. And I worked in the scullery, so my job was a dishwasher, and I would actually be, losing it while I was working. But as soon as the meal was over, I'd get a sleeve of saltine crackers, and I would eat saltine crackers until the lunch meal. Then I would come back and I'd be sick all over again. Then I'd get another sleeve of crackers and eat those, and I would do that 3 times a day. And as soon as the dinner meal was over, I would go to my rack and lay there in misery. So I had very little food, just in 4 days, but I had to keep something in my stomach. In fact, that's where I learned that when you're feeling seasick, you're much smarter to eat something than to give in to the oh, I don't want to eat anything, I might get sick. You need to have something in your stomach. I learned that. Lemon drops, I think, work good. Maybe. Okay. So he's encouraging them now, hey, we need to get something to eat. You guys have been, working night and day for 14 days. It's time to take a meal. Therefore, in verse 34, I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation, for not a hair from the head of any of you will perish. Boy, that's a confident statement, isn't it? How many people are on this ship?
276.
267, I think.
260 persons,
260?
says in verse 37.
Mine says 276. Is that what you said?
Oh, 76.
276.
I read that.
So a lot of people. Not one person on this ship is going to perish. What a statement of confidence for Paul to make. Having said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and he began to eat. So Paul says, everybody should eat. He offers up a prayer to God, and then he eats himself. All of them were encouraged, and they also took food. Now, all of us in the ship were 276 persons. And I kind of pointed this out when we started out, how big the ship was, 180 feet long and probably 50 feet wide, and maybe four stories high. It takes a pretty big ship to accommodate 276 passengers and crew. And, everybody doesn't have a stateroom. It's not like you're on a cruise ship. There's most of it's just common area, but there was accommodations of some type for that many people. Verse 38 says, when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. And so I think I pointed out early on that this was a freighter that was carrying cargo from to Rome, and its main cargo was wheat, and so this wheat would have most likely been packaged in some sort of a bag, like a gunny sack or maybe barrels, and so they begin to lighten some more. So we already read where they threw some stuff overboard, right? And I had said that was probably like light stuff, furniture and that kind of stuff. But now they're getting into the main cargo, and they're starting to lighten the ship up. When day came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a bay with a beach, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. So it's daylight now. They can see, okay, there's a landmass here. We see something that looks like a beach. We're going to aim for that. We're going to aim for that beach and hope for the best. Hope to drive the ship up on there. Much better to beach a vessel than to put it up on the rocks or a reef or something of that nature. Now, casting off the anchors, what anchors were they that they're casting off now? The 4 stern anchors. They left them in the sea while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders. So remember, one of the things that we said was they pulled the rudders up when the waves got really bad, because if you can imagine, you got something like a big long oar sticking out, but with a much larger surface area to maneuver the ship. In a bad storm, that thing could get snapped off. And you don't want to ever be without your rudder. So they would bring those things up and tie them off to secure them. And then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they were heading for the beach. Some translations here say mainsail. And so there's a big debate in amongst the commentaries on what sail it is, but mostly what I read, it's more likely is just a smaller main or a foresail, a sail at the front of the ship. And obviously there must be some wind that they think they're going to capture to help move the ship in the direction that they want to go. Verse 41, but striking a reef where 2 seas met, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves. So the front of the ship, remember, we're aiming for the beach. We haven't heard anything else about any more soundings being taken, but the natural tendency is the land runs up, the water gets shallower and shallower. Obviously, in my mind, what I picture is something below the waves that they couldn't see that the ship ran up on. And now they've got all the force of the waves behind them, and it's starting to break apart the ship. I don't think I have it. Okay, so we're clear over here. We're approaching this area here, Malta. And remember, they didn't recognize the land. That means, from what the scholars say, ships have been going to Malta for a long time. And I have another picture we'll look at, but it seems like they're quite a bit further north than the main harbor port that ships would be going to. And so when it's light and they see the land, they don't see any telltale signs. Like if they were coming into the main port of Malta, there would have been a big statue that, there would be structures that they could go, oh, hey, we're coming into Malta. And, they've been in a 14-day storm where they really have no idea where they've been tossed around, right? So the ship's getting broken up from the rear. And what we read in verse 42 is the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape.
Good plan.
Well, probably a normal plan, because what is the penalty that we read about in Scripture for soldiers who lose control of their prisoners? It's a death sentence for those soldiers. And so they would rather, I'm guessing, be able to tell their boss nobody escaped than to say, oh yeah, well, we lost. And we don't know how many of these individuals are prisoners and how many of them are paying passengers and how many of them are crew. We know there's more than one one prisoner based on what's being said here. They want the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, plural, so that none of them would swim away and escape. But the centurion, he's the boss, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention. So the centurion says, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to kill the soldiers. And remember, what did Paul say? Unless we all go, that's going to be a problem. So he commanded those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. And then everyone else who can't swim should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. And so it happened that they all were brought safely to land. So the scripture tells us all 276 made it to shore. All right. Any questions or comments down through there? We should have got the last of our questions answered. How long did the storm last? 14 days. How far had they sailed? I think I mentioned last 500 and some miles, I think it was. Did I have that on a slide? I meant to. 590-ish. So that's a long ways. And I think I had it on your paper. 590 miles, about 42 miles a day, or about 2 miles an hour if you average the math out. And then, what was the main commercial cargo on the ship? What was going to happen if anyone abandoned ship? Okay, and then how many people died when the ship ran aground and broke up? 0. All right. Now we're going to chapter 28, and you should have a handout for that, and you should have some study questions. Becky, go ahead. Michael, can you get the handouts to those people who didn't get one? Thank you. So, the chapter key for this verse, or for this, the chapter key for this chapter is Paul's arrival in Rome. Paul's arrival in Rome. And remember, we're here at what we have labeled Malta. In Scripture, what they knew it as then was Melita. And so, verse 1 of chapter 28 says, when they had been brought safely through, then we found out that the island was called Malta or Melita. This, according to our chapter notes, this island is called Melita in the King James Version. It's about 17 miles long, 9 miles wide, and located approximately 90 miles southwest of Syracuse. Syracuse will be another port that we're going to get introduced to, which is on Sicily. It was conquered by Rome in about 242 BC, and with excellent natural harbors, it was a convenient haven for ships. So, Melita or Malta, this is a modern picture of the bay that they believe is St. Paul's Bay. And we'll have another picture that, and again, I don't know that we know like 100% certain, but this is what the scholars are leaning towards. So on this picture here, this is that bay right that I just showed you. This is St. Paul's Bay. I'm sorry I couldn't blow that up and keep it more clear. There's a little land mass right here. There's actually water between here, and you can't see it well in this picture. But this is the island of Malta right here, or Melita. And so there's actually a statue, a St. Paul statue out on this little spit of land. They think that is likely where the ship got grounded. All right. Verse 2, the natives showed us extraordinary kindness, for because of the rain that had set in and because of the cold, they kindled the fire and received us all. in our chapter notes it says the natives, literally the word there is barbarians. And if you did not speak Greek, then to a Roman you were considered a barbarian. That was just a common thing. That did not mean that you were part of an ignorant, savage, uncivilized group of people, but simply that you did not know Greek. How do you suppose Paul's going to be able to communicate with these guys if they don't know Greek? That's a good question, because I don't know that I know the answer, but it occurred to me as I was like, if they don't speak Greek, now we know Paul speaks Hebrew too. Maybe he speaks other languages. We know that he has the power of the Holy Spirit also. But we also are going to discover he is going to be communicating with them. All right, verse 3. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand. Our chapter note said this is thought to be an adder, and it was evidently recognized to be a poisonous snake based on the reaction of the natives in verses 4 and 6. Now, interestingly, I took this from the Google. The viper was well known in the lands of Scripture as a small but deadly desert snake whose bite injected swift-acting venom. Because it often hid beneath sand or debris, the creature embodied treachery, hidden danger, and mortal threat. Within the Old Testament, serpents already stood as emblems of deception and of divine judgment. And against that backdrop, the New Testament writers invoked the viper to sharpen prophetic warnings. Remember Jesus, what does Jesus call or John the Baptist, what did he call the Pharisees that were coming out to be baptized? You brood of vipers. Now, this caused me to want to research some more. There are no venomous snakes currently on the island of Malta. There are 4 species of snakes, and they're all protected. One of them, well, let me rephrase that. One of them has a very mild venom to it, and I don't remember what kind of a snake it was. But we know from Scripture that there was some type of a venomous snake. And the reaction that these natives give is, oh, he's probably going to die because he just got bit by this snake. Verse 4, when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they began saying to one another, undoubtedly, this man is a murderer. And though he has been saved from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. What do you think about that statement?
Heathens. Absolute heathens.
The barbarians are heathens?
The barbarians are heathens.
So that maybe they have some superstition?
Yes.
Yeah, right? Oh, this must be going to happen. It seems to me, and I was going to look this up, and there's another story somewhere in Scripture similar to this, right?
The friends of Job.
The friends of Job. I was thinking of another instance where was there another instance where somebody gets, something happens to them and people automatically assume.
Oh, the boy that was born in blindness.
Oh yeah, the sin of the parents. Yeah, I'm not picking up on what I was thinking, so I'm just going to move on. But I think there is something. Maybe I'll remember it for next week. So these individuals have some superstition that when you get bit by a snake, it's for a reason. And even though he escaped this big savage steam, justice has not allowed him to live. So what are they expecting is going to happen to Paul? You're going to drop dead. Okay. However, Paul shook the creature off into the fire and suffered no harm.
That's why there's no venomous snakes.
Well, I'm gonna go with the natives know their snakes, and kind of like, if we saw somebody today actually get bit by a rattlesnake, we would be concerned. Or I'm not a snake guy. I don't know how many. I know there's lots of venomous snakes, but we would be concerned. We would even be concerned if it was our pet. We have some friends that have a sibling to Scrappy, and their dog got bit by a rattlesnake, and now they had to rush it to a vet, but now they carry anti-venom with them when they're horseback riding in the woods. Okay, verse 6. But they were expecting that he was about to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. So that's what they're expecting based on what's happened. But after they had waited a long time and had seen nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and began to say that he was a god. And we don't know what a long time is, but it seems like it's maybe in the same day here. When Paul did not drop dead from the snake's bite, the people then decided he must be a god. This is the opposite of what happened to Paul in Acts 14, 8 through 19, what Ron put for us in these notes, which, remember, they were trying to make Paul out to be a god. He's Zeus, and the other guy was supposed to be Hermes or something. Okay, verse 7. Now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the leading man of the island, whose name was Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us courteously for 3 days. So obviously on the island of Malta, there's some sort of government, we could say. There's a leading man. He's the leading man of the island, and he entertains presumably everybody from the ship for 3 days. Verse 8, well, let me read verse 7's notes. The name of the individual that was called the leading man of the island and is thought by some to have been a Roman appointed governor of the island. We don't know if he or anyone else ever became Christians, but some traditions say that he did, and that he even died a martyr. It's interesting to me that in these last couple of chapters of Acts, where we see Paul interacting with people, we don't really see or read anything about people being converted or churches getting established. But that doesn't mean it couldn't have happened, right? Just because Luke didn't record it for us does not mean that it could not have happened. All right, verse 8 says, and it happened that the father of Publius was lying in bed afflicted with recurrent fever and dysentery, and Paul went in to see him, and after he had prayed, he laid his hands on him and he healed him. Dysentery was an intestinal disorder. Most of us have probably heard of it. Paul miraculously healed Publius's father of both the fever and the dysentery, and then after that, others are going to be healed as well. This is going to add some credibility to Paul as far as, the people from the ship, and then the locals as well. Going to see the power of God working in Paul, right? After this had happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases were coming to him and getting cured. So we see Paul, he's got a little clinic set up now, right? And we kind of picture this in Jesus' ministry, right? Whenever Jesus performed a miracle and people heard about it, all of a sudden they were bringing all kinds of sick people to Jesus. All kinds of sick people were being brought to Jesus. And we kind of see the same thing happening here. They've seen that Paul has this power to heal, and so they're bringing their sick to him.
It makes you think, what is this centurion thinking?
Oh, yeah.
He really liked Paul, but now he's seeing all this stuff happen.
Yeah.
Heard his prophecy on the boat.
Mm-hmm.
So the centurions are being affected, and the 270 that were with Paul
Yeah.
being treated well because of what Paul's doing.
Yeah.
And then also you think that they're probably hearing Paul preach the gospel because obviously Paul preaches
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway, just kind of an interesting turn of events here.
Yeah, adds a lot of credibility to everything so far that they have seen or heard from Paul. Don't be afraid, we're all going to make it. They all make it. Paul begins to do this miraculous work. And you know, if we were there, would it have an effect on us? I think it would. I think it would have an effect on anybody that has an open mind, right? Where's he getting this power from? Does Paul ever, in any of the writings that we read, does Paul ever say, oh, it's from me? No, he always gives, he always attributes the power to God. Verse 10 then says, they also honored us with many marks of respect, and when we were setting sail, they supplied us with all that we needed. So, we're getting ready to leave Malta. It's been about 3 months. About 3 months on Malta. How long do you suppose this whole episode has lasted from the time that Paul left? Where did he start on this? Where was he when we started? Caesarea Maritima. And now we're in Malta. We're going to get to Rome. How long's that whole trip about? And we don't have an exact date, but we have speculation. About 6 months. Maybe a couple of months from the time he left Caesarea until the time he gets to Malta. And then they're 3 months in Malta. Why would 3 months be a good time to be in Malta? Winter. Right? Well, there's no patching up the ship. So winter, remember, that was one of the things Paul had warned them about. This is not a good time of the year to be sailing. We should lay up here in Fair Haven for the winter. I think bad things are going to happen, but no, we're going. They had a little conference. Paul got outvoted. The captain and the owner of the ship and the centurion. So they're waiting for winter to pass, which would be a logical thing to do because the sea is different after winter is over.
And they have to contact the insurance company.
Yep. They had to contact the insurance company. Had to find another vessel. You're not going to walk from Malta to Rome because it is an island. All right. Verse 11 says, at the end of 3 months, we set sail on an Alexandrian ship which had wintered at the island which had the twin brothers for its figurehead. So what kind of ship was he on that wrecked? It was also an Alexandrian ship. And from what I read, many of the Alexandrian ships were identified as Alexandrian ships. They were cargo vessels. And so it is thought that this probably is another wheat carrying vessel that's on its way to Rome. And when it got to Malta, we don't know. We don't know if it was already there when they crashed. We're not given that information, but we have a wonderful picture for you of another vessel. Here's the wheat, and then here's the twin brother figurehead. Remember what the other ship most likely had was a bird. And it's just interesting to me that Luke gives us these details. He could have just said a ship. It makes it a lot more. The more details there are in any kind of a story, it can add to credibility, right? And so that's just a wonderful mark of Luke's writing.
Well, if you give a detail like that, that's not a detail that someone telling a legend would tell, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's an eyewitness account. I think I read it somewhere in Mark talks about how when Jesus fed the 5,000 that he had to go sit down on the green grass. Include the color of the grass, you have to be there to know.
Mm-hmm.
It was green, it was brown. And so, like you said, it adds credibility, but it just adds, like, you couldn't honestly give a detail like that unless you either were eyewitness or were speaking to eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
So,
All right. So we're leaving Malta on board another Alexandrian ship, and we are headed to, where are we going? I know ultimately where we're going. Our next stop is going to be Syracuse. So right up here on the island of Sicily. Syracuse is right there. And then I have some information for you about Syracuse. At that time, it was a prosperous, thriving port and the capital of the Roman province of Sicily. So you can see Messina is up there on the northern end and closer to the boot of Italy, or the mainland. It was renowned for its strategic harbor. The city was divided between the island of Ortigia, where Paul's ship most likely docked, and the grander mainland district of Neapolis. And I don't have a picture of that, but it didn't show up on the map. So they go a short distance, really. They arrive in Syracuse. We stayed there for 3 days. So some more time has gone by. From there, we sailed around and arrived at Rhegium. I'm guessing on that pronunciation. And a day later, a south wind sprang up, and the second day we came to Puteoli. So Rhegium, ancient Rhegium is now this modern Reggio Calabria, was a strategic Roman port city located on the toe. So we're back up here now on the toe of the mainland. Situated directly across from the Strait of Messina from Sicily, in the Apostle Paul's day, it served as a vital maritime waypoint for ships navigating the notoriously hazardous strait between Italy and Sicily. So I didn't do any reading on that, but apparently that's a hazardous waterway between Sicily and Italy. And so a day later, a south wind sprang up, and on the second day, they came to this place called Puteoli, another ancient port city. It was the premier bustling harbor of the Roman Empire on the Bay of Naples. In Paul's day, it served as the main gateway for Eastern trade, grain shipments, and travelers entering Italy. The city was a cosmopolitan, culturally diverse hub featuring extensive docks, an amphitheater, and a prominent Jewish community. And again, we're there on in the toe of the mainland of Italy. There we found some brethren. Well, why would they find some brethren? There's a prominent Jewish community. We know the gospel has already gone out to the known world in some fashion. But they found some brethren here in Puteoli. So, and we were invited to stay with them for 7 days, and thus we came to Rome. So when you read that verse right there, it makes it sound like we stayed with them 7 days and then we were in Rome. But that's not going to be the case. There's going to be we're going to do some over the land travel now in order to get Paul all the way to Rome. I mentioned that we don't really hear of a church or Christians, but maybe this is an indication that there are Christians here in this port city of Puteoli. So I think this is where we're going to end for tonight, at verse 14. Any questions or comments on that? No?
It makes you wonder how they went about finding other Christians. You know, if these brethren were waiting for Paul, if they knew in advance that Paul was on a ship, or if they'd been given some sign from the Lord that they needed to be out in the port to meet these guys, or what?
That's a good question, and I asked that myself because when you look at the next verses, people are going to be traveling from Rome 40 miles because they know Paul's coming. Well, how did they find out Paul was coming? Did they telephone? He what?
He was probably supposed to be there a while ago. When they left Caesarea, word could have traveled.
It could have. It's interesting to me that, and we'll talk about this next week, but it's interesting to me that when he goes to the Jews in Rome and he says that all this stuff happened, they said, oh, we haven't heard anything about it. Now that was the Jews, but it's possible that, that there was correspondence that went ahead and that kind of thing. So,
They found out that he was there somehow.
yes, we know that we're not necessarily going to know how they found out, but we are going to know that they know. So in chapter 28, what was the chapter key? Paul arrival in Rome. What was the name of the island where the shipwreck occurred? Malta. What's the alternate name? Okay. What was Paul bitten by? Okay. How did the locals react to that incident of Paul getting bit?
At first, they thought it was justice for surviving the storm, and then when he didn't die, they thought of him as a god.
Okay. What was the name of the leading man? Publius? All right. What was the first sickness that Paul healed on the island? Fever and dysentery. How long was Paul on the island? 3 months. All right, and we're going to get through 8. So where did the ship stop after it left Malta? A, B, and C. First place was Syracuse. And then Rhegium, or however you want to pronounce that. And then Puteoli. Okay. And then we'll pick up with questions 9 through 13 on next week. So here's what's going to be going on. I'll just share this with you. I'll turn my mic.